with you online as well. My name's Sarah, and I'm on the staff here at the church as a pastor in the community. And it's really wonderful that we can share with you to really encourage and support you in your parenting. And as a church, we really want to stand with you and work with you to make the best family atmosphere and environment for you and your children. And we're really, really excited to have Andrew here with us to give us some advice and have the opportunity to share from his knowledge and experience about all sorts of things to do with growing responsible adults. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he's got to say.
So I heard about Andrew first by reputation. A number of young people that I know have done your program, Andrew, The Right Journey. Then I read online that you have, now let me see if I've got this right, you have 4 children, 3 stepchildren, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Wow, that's a lot of people. And I'm quite interested, what are the age ranges, Andrew?
So from 25 down to 10, and a fairly even spread, and the girls at the elder end and then boys at the younger end.
Fantastic. Married to Becky,
yes,
have I got this right?
Right, yep.
And you've been doing work in the area of rites of passage and I guess adolescent boys as well. For how long now?
Yeah, well, 1997 was when we first started doing something with the boys. It was at Cornerstone College, which is a Lutheran school up in the Adelaide Hills, and that's sort of when it birthed and has evolved since then, and sort of was never intended to be really working with other people. It was just for those boys at Cornerstone at that stage, but it did seem to fill a bit of a gap, and so that's how sort of took off from there. And then some other schools became interested, and now we're doing it a little more widespread.
Well, fantastic. I have worked with young people for a long time. So I was a youth pastor, youth worker for about 17 years. And I know that when people think about working with teenagers, it's like the black arts. It's a mystery, it's a puzzle, it's a concern. So I think tonight we're really looking forward to hearing from you and what you might bring to us. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and let's hope all of our technology works. We had a little bit of a scramble just beforehand to get the slides working. So let's kick into it, and we look forward to hearing from you, Andrew. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Sarah. And really lovely to have some people here in the room, but also to all of you at home, welcome. And I just want to start by saying, this is, I guess I've had a fair bit of lived experience teaching teenagers for 25 years, and as I mentioned, having seven kids, stepkids, means there's been lots of experience, lots of trial and error. Still continue to get it wrong, but I'm not certainly no expert, just someone who's had some experience and noticed some things. And so what I offer comes with love, no judgment, but it'll be interesting just to sort of take a gaze over a little bit about how parenting has shifted over the years, how things are for our young people at this point, this generation coming through, and have a little bit of a think about what we can do with that. So we'll just get through to the slides, or will I need to get that played up the back? Here we go. So a couple of quotes there to start with. One is, it's not what you do for your children, but what you've taught them to do for themselves that will make them successful human beings, by Anne Landers. And the other one that we don't really know who mentioned it, but was don't prepare the path for the child, but rather prepare the child for the path. And that's what I'd like to be looking at. How can we raise our young children and young people to be prepared for life ahead? I'm interested to know what parents are wanting of their children when they get into adulthood. So I did this particular survey, which 5 qualities will best serve, has that come up? Which 5 qualities would best serve the children into adulthood? And number 1 was resilience. So I said, what 5 things would you like your children to have when they're adults? And resilience was the number 1. Half of people had that in their top 5. And I found that interesting. I mean, you can look through and you see kindness and empathy and moving down. But one of the things I found interesting with that stat was I don't see a lot of parenting that's building resilience. I see a lot of parenting that's actually protecting kids, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. The next slide is from a book called The Happiest Kids in the World. And has anyone been to Amsterdam? Because apparently Dutch teenagers are the happiest teenagers on the planet. Now, if you've been to Amsterdam, you might have your idea as to why Dutch teenagers are the happiest teenagers on the planet. But in actual fact, the research suggests that it's because they're less over-parented. There's more independence training. Now, that's sort of what the research is telling us, that once kids, when there's less over-parenting, they're actually happier, which is not what I actually see here in our, Australian parenting. What I generally see is parents who sort of think the more we can do for our kids, the happier they will be. The easier we make life for them, the happier they will be. But I'd like to just present something a little bit different this evening, because what we find is that not only are kids not happier, what we're also doing is not creating great adults. And we're hearing a lot of reports about young people who, for instance, I have a friend who is a lecturer in education at Flinders Uni, in teaching. And the other year, he had a mum contact him because they failed the fourth year son in his teaching prac. So he's doing fourth year university, and the lecturers are getting emails, "Why did you fail my son?" And so what we're finding is that even as kids are moving well into adulthood, they're not really taking responsibility, that they're looking for people to blame, and that's something I think we can make a shift with. Because of course, as parents, we're meant to be doing ourselves out of a job. And as I've worked more and more with young people, what I've realised is, 18 is when we give every young person all the freedoms of adulthood. In Australia, there's nothing that comes after that. And I mean, it's probably a terrible idea now that we have the brain research, which tells us that 23 to 27 is probably when the prefrontal cortex is fully formed. So if we had our time again, we might say, well, actually, let's make it 25. But it's 18. That's what we've got to work with. And I feel like we need to be doing a better job. I believe we need to be doing a better job in schools as well, but also as parents, and using 18 as that threshold. Because if we're saying, here are all the freedoms, I believe we should have done a better job of preparing our young people for that moment. In a number of countries, it happens partly because, for instance, in the UK and the US, often at 18, kids are leaving home to go and study away from home. So for parents, there's an end point. They're like, my kid's leaving home in a year's time, I've got to have taught them some stuff. We sort of have less pressure, certainly in urban Australia, where young people tend not to travel away, they tend to stay at home. And you can imagine the average age of leaving home is creeping up, towards mid-20s. The author John Marsden, he mentions in his book, which is called The Art of Growing Up, he talks about the fact that you can't blame teenagers for how they are. That's our job. It's our job as teachers and our job as parents. And so what can we do to make a difference? So what I want to talk about tonight is going to be, it's proactive rather than reactive parenting, I like to think of it as. Feel free to take notes. In the follow-up to this, I think you'll all get an email, and I'll include a little template which will help you look at the ages that we'll talk about a little bit later this evening. And I'd love you, if you could take home a couple of ideas, I would be really pleased that I've made a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to just ask the people here who are live, what do you think the experience for your kids at the age they happen to be at the moment, how is that different? What's the biggest difference perhaps compared to when you were that age? Just have a couple of people yell out. Those of you who are at home, if you have a think about it as well. Yeah.
rarely socialises outside. When I was his age, we were never home. We were out all the time with friends.
Okay, thank you. So that's about when we were kids, we were possibly out and about a bit more, socialising, rather than how the young people are today. Another one?
Catching buses as soon as you start high school, just going a long way by yourself, or walking to school a long way for primary school.
Yeah, thank you. So they call it the roaming range. So you can imagine what's happened to the roaming range from the 60s through the 70s, the 80s to now. It's really, it's probably moved from being kilometres, tens of kilometres, to maybe hundreds of metres, maybe. Another one.
I've just found, obviously, there's the social media impact, but I feel like that's made our children a lot more inward focused and image focused than maybe we were.
Yeah, so technology and social media has had a huge impact, and I think I think every generation laments the state of the teenagers coming through. I think there's even a Greek philosopher who quoted about how poor the teenagers were coming through many years ago. But I don't know that there's been a generation where the shift has been as great. That is, the difference for the parents compared to what their kids are going through has been as significant as what we would be experiencing. And I think that's cause for some investigation and thinking about what we can do. One of the things we've done with students is ask them a question: what my parents don't know about social media is. And they sort of anonymously answer, and then we can feed it back to the parents at a meeting. But on these particular slides, there's things about being on it until late into the evening. There's things about nudes. There's things about so much swearing and inappropriate conversation and language, and that's quite significant. Another thing that's come out of the University of Singapore, and I've done a little bit of work over there, is looking at what the qualities, so they went to the employers actually and said, what qualities do young people need to be thriving in the years ahead? And a whole lot of it was what we would call the softer skills, but the social emotional skills, and you can see them up there. And I think it's worth having a think about, okay, so what were things like when we were kids? I'm not going to say it's good or bad or wrong or right, but I just would like to explore it and have a little bit of a think about what it is that we can do in response to it. So you might remember in the good old days when you were pretty happy if you had a 4-colour pen, which is a little bit different to how things are for kids these days. So we've already mentioned a little bit about this, the play. And I'd hop on a bike and I'd go riding. And, Mum apparently really didn't care where I went. She wouldn't even really ask. She'd just say, be home by dinner. And that's quite different to parents who are putting trackers on kids to see where they are the whole time. And I learnt a lot on those rides. I lived up at Aberfoyle Park and would ride down Flagstaff Hill Road and go to Magic Mountain, for those of you who remember it, down at Glenelg, and spend the afternoon down there. And you'd learn a lot when you're out and about by yourself. There were skills, there were responses to things. If you saw someone you didn't like the look of, you might think, gee, I might go to the other side of the road. There's a whole lot of just little things that you learn about being independent. Of course, these days, as we've already mentioned, that's less common to be travelling as far. I'd like to suggest actually, though, that it's probably riskier for your kids in their home with the internet being beamed in through the ceiling than it is for them, out on the street. So you might remember we would have games nights. There'd be a lot of family stuff. I can remember we had very strict rules around being at the dinner table. The TV couldn't be on. We would have grace. There'd be some ritual, and it was all expected. And I wouldn't dare go against my parents with that. If you can get all of your kids into one room, which is even very difficult these days, you can see that picture with all those screens. I mean, one kid's there's got a phone and a computer and the telly. There's a lot of sort of human disconnect, which has also been brought up just in the general socialisation as well. Then I've already mentioned how things were in families, and my family sitting around the dinner table. That's a bit of a change. I'm not sure if you remember what it was like having to wait a whole week for the next episode of something. So, again, Netflix is fine, but where do the kids learn to delay gratification? If there aren't these just little moments where it's like, oh, there we go, and I'm hanging on the edge of my seat for, 7 more sleeps till the next thing. So again, just no judgment on it, but how can we help bring that around for the young people? You might remember the phone that was on the wall. Now, a couple of things come to mind with that. One was, if I ever rang a friend, I'd be really hoping that it wasn't going to be the parent who answered the phone, but usually it was. And as a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old, I'd have to pretend to be an adult. I'd have to speak to an adult. Hello, Mr. Jones. Yep. No, I had a good day at school. And then I'm thinking, what should I say? Did you have a good day at work? Or however you might respond. But having to step into that adulthood, speak to an adult, is important. You can imagine that these days that's happening less, especially with the advent of mobile phones. So kids are connecting. But we even see it in schools. How many times parents will come in and advocate for the child. That's changed a little bit as well. The other thing with the phone is I could escape a bully at school because I could come home. And how would have they got me? Well, they would have either turned up, knocked on the door, or rang the house. Probably wouldn't have, written a letter. But that's how things would have had to have happened, and it didn't. I was safe. I had a refuge at home between 4 p.m. and 8 a.m. from the stuff that was going on. I hope you can see that if we allow our kids access to devices 24/7, we're actually denying them the place of refuge. Does that make sense? We're not letting them have the space where they're not contactable, where they can be safe from that stuff. And I think that's really important for us to ponder. The Mission Australia Youth Survey, for the first time in 2019, mental health was in the top 3 for young people. That's them saying what they're concerned about themselves. So I believe that the advent of social media has a little bit to play with that. And of course, back in the old days, you could just block someone by doing that. And then what about risk? So there's the kind of trampoline you probably jumped on as a kid, and there's the kind of trampoline your children probably jump on. And one of the questions I wonder is, if kids aren't learning to assess risk in their backyard, where there's adults around and it's pretty safe, when will they learn to assess that risk? You've all done it. It's not a massive risk assessment. It's just, am I still in the middle? Am I still in the middle? And if you're not, then you just do something about it. Malachi, my son, has a little scar on his cheekbone from smacking his head on the edge of a trampoline. But it happened. I was there. I could pick him up and say, hey, mate, I reckon we're going to have to get some stitches. And off we go to the doctor. I'd rather he's learning about the edges at 10 when I'm there than he's had no opportunity to do that, but it happens at 19, driving at 110 kilometres an hour through the Adelaide Hills, and that's when he starts to experience edges and learn about them. Does it make sense? The small stakes experiences are really important. And sadly, the net sort of denies that. And we're not just literally putting up nets. We're figuratively protecting our kids from having these little experiences. That's probably the type of playground your grandparents played on the left-hand side there. And I do generally like to point out that I think the person on the left is swinging from something rather than plummeting to their death off the top of the playground equipment. Although I did think the other day, I don't even know where the photo's from. It could be from the coroner's office, in which case maybe that did happen. But for those of you who are South Australian, you might be familiar with Monash Playground that's there. So that's what I went to as a kid. It was amazing. There weren't any signs that said be careful, nothing. In fact, you didn't get to the bottom of the ladder and find knee pads or elbow pads or helmets. You actually found an item which would make it a heck of a lot riskier, Hessian sacks. And that's what they'd sort of, give you to zip down just that little bit quicker. There's something in that. I've worked with young men for a long time and boys, and there's something in that adrenaline. There's something that's needed. You might remember, some of the guys here, what you played at lunchtime. Mugby, we used to call it. And it was we just chucked a ball around and tackled each other, and we'd be so stuffed when we got back in after lunch. We mustn't have made a noise probably for the teachers. You know that a lot of that stuff doesn't happen anymore. So where do the boys, young men, and girls as well, get that? They'll get it, but it's just going to be somewhere else. They'll hunt it down. And my concern is it's not going to be as innocent as, a playground or Mugby, where they're looking for that thrill and that being on the edge. There's a Roald Dahl quote, which is really about allowing kids to have some risks. That's my son Malachi retrieving the tennis ball that he whacked up on the roof, up the lattice there. And then what about with things like bubble wrapping and cotton wool? What can you think? Something risky that you did as a kid. I'm keen to hear a couple of responses to this one. Something risky that you probably wouldn't see kids doing. And at home, if you can have a think about, and I'd be interested, maybe you shouldn't share them with your kids, but just thinking about the things that you did that were a little bit risky. We've got a couple of people who are happy to share something.
Coming from Scotland, I remember there was this massive hill in the town where I grew up. And in the middle of winter, we would fly down that on sledges. And at the bottom of the hill was a road. So you had to watch both sides and try and make sure you timed it right to go straight across the road.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Someone else?
Well, seeing as a large part of my upbringing was up at a country farm, then we used to actually put a small amount of diesel on the bottom of a 4-gallon drum, throw it on the bonfire when we were actually burning up the rubbish, and it would slowly expand as the diesel came under pressure, and then it would blow the bottom of the 4-gallon drum off, and a serrated disc would go flying through the air, and we'd be lying in a ditch because we had no idea where this serrated disc was going to go.
Thank you. We've suddenly just made this an MA 15 plus event, haven't we, with a couple of those tales?
Here.
Oh yeah, thank you, Sarah.
One of them, and I was thinking the same, was climbing trees. It seems to be a lost art. Riding my bike down a really steep street as fast as I can go with no helmet. Taking the train to school, keeping the doors open in summer because it was hot.
Yeah.
A lot of taking the trains or travelling across places.
Great.
By themselves.
Thank you. Thanks for those of you at home for sending that in. That's wonderful. Michael Carr-Gregg calls it the wussification of kids in this particular article. He says, we give kids certificates, they're getting these things for just participating. And he goes on in this article to actually talk about a mum he was working with whose son's goldfish died while he was at school one day. And she rang up Michael Carr-Gregg with the wonderful idea of going to the pet shop, getting a lookalike to put into the bowl before he got home from school. And she said, does that sound okay to you? And apparently Michael Carr-Gregg said, you do know one day that goldfish is going to be you. And there's that suggestion of why would you protect your kid from having a small stakes experience of grief with a goldfish. The phrase we sometimes use is guide, don't guard. You know, they're wonderful learning opportunities for kids. And it's really, you know, our job as parents not to protect them, but to help them deal with these disappointments. Let's see if we can get to the next slide. I've got it up on the back there, Jason, but it's not on this one here. Okay. Sorry, folks. Okay, no worries. So, any questions or anything while we're just waiting? Yeah, thank you. Has anyone got experience of kids at school at the moment that they're willing to reflect on, and how things are going with whether they're actually having, you know, competitive races like that still, or perhaps going for sort of everyone gets a prize? I mean, I was chatting to someone the other day who talked about, it was an older guy. I was speaking at an event, and he mentioned about he was taking his grandson to a party and needed to provide the parcel for the party, and got in trouble from his daughter because he'd only put a prize in the middle, like we used to, rather than a prize at every layer, so everyone got a prize. So he was just reflecting on that. Anybody else got an opinion or thought on that?
And at the moment, they're not keeping the score, but every kid on both teams know exactly what the score is. So it's kind of whether that's positive or pointless.
Yeah. And again, you know, I'm not judging these things, but I'm wondering at what point do kids learn, you know, when is appropriate to learn? And I mean, that can be different for all kids, each kid. Yeah.
I was reading a book by Douglas Murray about the madness of crowds, and he suggested that perhaps it's not so much that people, like young ones these days, are sort of suffering from this snowflake mentality, but that perhaps it's also that because the times keep changing all the time, that there is a genuine fear and anxiety of saying anything. Like tonight, I made some comment about whatever, and I got in strife from my daughter for being ableist. That wasn't a thing 10 years ago. Yeah. Like, it's one thing to, you know, let's not be homophobic, then it's transphobic, now it's ableist. Like, it's that whole thing that things keep changing and changing. And if you say something wrong, you get drilled. And you know, and especially as a young one, they'll know if they've typed something wrong and it's out there for all to see, then it's social suicide. And so there is a genuine fear that as you continue to put stuff out there, like you could be like in real strife for crossing the line and you're the next bigot. Yeah,
thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And, you know, our kids are living... I mean, I only had to be the funniest kid at my school. You know, that was my circle of influence. Or the best-looking kid. Or the best, you know, sportsman, whatever it was. Our kids are competing against the planet. You know, they're watching the whole planet do stuff, and they're trying to match that. And that's a tough ask. Thanks for rebooting that. Let's see if there we go. So yes, this idea that our job as parents is to teach them how to deal with the disappointment rather than sort of keep them from it. And, you know, when we think about failure, we're sort of hardwired. You know, there's not many adults you see crawling around on the floor because they just decided that walking wasn't for them after they'd given it a crack for a couple of times. You know, there is this thing where we keep going until we make it. And Tim Elmore's, I like that little part of the quote there, which is, "We rescue too early." I talk about that with teachers as well, that tendency to step in. And it comes up a bit when we talk about giving kids tasks to do at home. And, you know, they'll tend to be slower. They'll tend to be messier. You know, there's a number of things, but to deny them the opportunity of learning those things just because we feel like it's a little bit messier or it's a little bit dirtier, you know, I don't really think that's terribly fair on them. You might remember in the old days getting bored, and how do you sort of, you know, how did you manage that as a kid? And I would have never blamed my parents or expected them to be entertaining me. But there's this idea that there's a lot of, you know, scheduling of kids these days, and there's been a bit of research done on that and the fact that parents are organising a whole lot, which I think was sort of alluded to before as well, rather than kids just sort of, you know, I can remember just organising to go and have a hit of tennis with mates at the, you know, Happy Valley Tennis Club or popping down the shops or something like that. I had piano practice one night and maybe a sports practice, but I wasn't really, you know, I didn't have a lot of stuff sort of set up. And then this concept, I don't know if you remember taking home a report card that wasn't terribly flattering. I can just remember feeling a little anxious about that, about what my parents would say and how they would expect me to get my act together and do a little bit better. Now, in education, what we're seeing these days is that parents are fronting up to us as teachers and telling us, what are you going to do about my kids' results? And so when I'm working in schools, I'm very strongly saying to parents, you know, please don't be that parent. You know, just, I mean, there might be the very odd time where that's important, but I encourage my kids. I had my daughter come home a couple of years ago. She was in year 11. She said, "Dad, can you go and talk to Mrs. So-and-so, my English teacher, about this?" And I'm like, "Well, have you spoken to her yet?" And she's, "No." I'm like, "Well, you see her every day. Why don't you talk to her? If you don't have any luck with her, there'll be a head of English, then there'll be a deputy principal, then there'll be the principal. If you exhaust all those, come back to me and I'll have a think. I'll listen to what you've got to say and have a think about talking to someone." But I was thinking, she was in year 11. In 2 years' time, she's either going to be in tertiary education or a workplace, and she needs to be having those conversations that might be a little bit difficult. And school's a pretty safe place for kids to practice those. And so that's why I really encourage parents to just hold off on that tendency to want to go straight into the teacher and just say, well, how are you going to manage this? What could you ask? What are the options? And just start helping them to be able to work through that kind of problem solving. So by the time they do need to do it in a workplace, they've maybe had a little bit of experience. This is the suite of things that parenting has been called in the last decade or so. So we've had helicopter parenting, which moved to lawnmower parenting, which moved to snowplow parenting, which was getting anything that was going to, you know, create a bump out of the way. And I love the Danish version, which is called curling parenting. So that idea of just making it nice and smooth so you just coast along. But, you know, it's really important that our kids feel the gamut of experiences. And it's really helpful if they feel that when we're there with them. Because if we just smother them and keep them away from that, I think what we see this day and age, and it's resulted in that the mental health in the Mission Australia survey, is that kids are getting into their mid-20s and haven't had to manage a lot of those experiences because they've really been sheltered from them. And then suddenly they're experiencing them in their 20s. And I wonder how we can, as I said earlier, guide, not guard. I'm going to talk briefly about male body image. So there's the Batman on the left that I had to aspire to as a young kid. And frankly, I've nailed that. My sons, however, they had the Batman on the right-hand side to aspire to. I'm going to show you a couple of clips. I don't think we're having much luck with the sound. This is the kind of things... the slide that should have come up beforehand was Mel and Kim. Respectable. That was the video I watched as a 13-year-old kid, 14-year-old kid. This is what our kids are watching. And of course, there's a huge issue in the sexualisation and the fact that when I was 14, almost a rite of passage for kids that age was stumbling across a Playboy magazine or the like. Do you know what it is now? It's hardcore porn. 87% of which has violence. Do you get the huge difference between looking at a still nude on a piece of paper, and it's something that we as parents need to comprehend and address. And there's some wonderful organisations that are doing some stuff, including Melinda Tankard-Reist and Collective Shout, who do some great advocacy. You know, I happened to be asked to speak to MC a symposium about 4 years ago. It was by a group that was called Porn Harms Kids, and we had sociologists and experts and health professionals from all over the country at the University of New South Wales. And, you know, it was really a little bit disheartening because I was sort of saying this is the biggest social experiment we've had for a long time, and there's no control group. Because statistics tell us that pretty much every, 14-year-old boy has seen porn. Not necessarily hunted it out, but has seen it. I often say, except, of course, for your son. But that's the reality. How are we, as the elders in our society, going to help kids with that? Because these are some of the results. The shift in plastic surgery, that there were young women who are considering having certain procedures done because of the pressures that are put on them by porn. There's a couple of great books available. These are two, and feel free to take photos of the screen, and for you, those of you at home as well. These two particular books, one's Good Pictures, Bad Pictures for younger kids, and then the one on the left is for older kids. And then another great resource, which I really recommend, is a video. It's a documentary by a couple, husband and wife from Wellington in New Zealand, called Our Kids Online, and that's available on Vimeo. It's probably $4 or something to hire, but that's really worth watching. So what do we do in relation to building a family culture? I want you to just have a think about a family ritual that you remember from your childhood, or a particular rule that you remember from your childhood. If we can have a couple of people who are happy to share that, and we might get some from those of you at home as well. So a ritual, feel free to yell it out and I can share it with the people at home.
Thanks to them, they taught us our manners from such a young age, and it started at home. And we knew how to use everything properly. And there was no TV, meal times were to spend it as a family.
Thank you. So that was another one sort of around the dinner table and courtesy and things like that. Have we got any from people at home there, Sarah?
Saturday night movie night.
Yeah.
Friday night takeaway dinner.
Yeah.
Family dinners was a theme, and saying please and thank you. No swearing. Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. I remember Sunday afternoons was visiting Grandma and Nana afternoon, and sometimes we'd have a takeaway then. In a time where, things are moving very quickly and there's a lot to take our attention away, this quote, when I saw Steve Biddulph for the first time many years ago, really struck me. This idea that hurry is the enemy of love. And I'm going to talk a little bit about in our families how we can perhaps get some rhythm and routine happening. So we'll have a brief look through some of these things here. One of the main purposes of routine and rhythm is to reduce the number of potential conflicts, really. Janet Paulson did a parenting course that I attended many, many years ago, and she used the phrase, it just becomes like the tide. It's just what we do. My kids get sick of hearing the phrase, well, that's what we do in our family. And I imagine I'll be using that well into when they're parenting, probably. But, it's keeping things regular, repetitive and reliable. And I like this phrase to help us remember that, that the less you have to ask, probably the less you have to argue. So if there are just things that are expected to happen, and it can be difficult because kids are not going to be putting their hand up and saying, you forgot to ask me to empty the recycling. There will be things, it does mean taking a stand, and it does mean setting boundaries and doing a number of things that sort of good parenting typically is. And, there has been a bit of a shift, I've noticed, into that parents just being friends and finding it difficult to really say, well, no, this is what happened. So I would encourage that just because it can just mean less arguments. And so some things you might want to think about. We've had morning routine charts so that we don't... These are the things you need to do before you leave for school. We're going to be leaving at 8:15. There's the list. That's what you need to do. That particular chart happened to be on the mornings that the youngest wanted porridge. So there needed to be time was a little bit different with the porridge morning compared to a cereal morning. We've used things like these cards. So taking them out of the not done pile, putting them into the done pile. My sister came up with this wonderful idea of a morning map. So the kids actually drew this and they just follow the arrows, and I don't know if you can read it, but on there somewhere is Poo Island. So the little reminder that at some stage some toileting is worth doing before you head off to school. And then I found this at an entrepreneurs event at a primary school where kids had created this evening routine little helper for families. And then so it sounds like a lot of people have mentioned things like this for having just rhythms and routines, but little rituals, like when are these things? I like the idea of the monthly birthday dinner. So I'm 25th of January, so 25th of the month, I'd get to choose what meal I want. And you just do that for each of the family. Just create these little things about building anticipation. And I found that beautiful set of seasonal prints up in Bellingen at a lovely little art shop there. And so we do that at the first day of the new season. We make mention of it. We say, okay, might do some gratitude for what's been. And then we put up the new picture in the hallway where we walk into the house, and the seasonal picture hangs there. And some people use season tables as well. So they'll change what's on the table to reflect the season that they're in at that moment. So, what is the family culture? How do we set it up as parents? What are the qualities? What are the behaviours, the traditions, the rituals? And, then it's not very long before the guidelines around, technology, alcohol, having kids, girlfriends, boyfriends, partners coming and staying over. It's good to be a little bit ahead of it. to sort of be saying, well, in 5 years' time, we might get this question, because you're probably going to get it in 2 years' time, so at least you've given yourself a little bit of leeway. We display our family culture. We've got this, our 10 commitments that we put. All the kids have signed off on that, and we have as parents. We had one of the boys who didn't want to sign off on it. It's like, oh, really? Okay, here we go. And so we talked through the consequences of what that might look like. Are you willing to? And gave it a couple of days, and he came back and said, actually, I'm happy to sign that now. We try to put up we got pictures of the grandparents, and just think of what the things are that are important to us. And sometimes we need a reminder, that one on the right, sits up near our dining table, and every now and then it's important to revisit that, because it just becomes part of the furniture and you don't even realise it's there. So just saying, remember that's up there. Remember, joy is a part of living in this house. So let's try and be joyful. And then we've talked a little bit about expressing feelings, and we've created some feeling cards. So the ones on the left are a more senior set, probably for kids, teenagers, 330 words. Now, if I ask you, what's the bank of words a 14-year-old boy has to draw from when you say, how are you? It's maybe 5 and probably 2 noises. How do we get kids? And that's not only what they're sharing, that's also what they're attaching to what they're feeling. So I think building emotional vocabulary is really important. We've created a primary set, so they have pictures, because we wanted kids to start to learn, what's that look like? What's the facial expression and body language of these particular feelings? We've even used there's a set you can get from a wonderful resource company called St. Luke's, Innovative Resources, I think they're called now. And they're koala cards. There's 20 of them. If you've got younger kids, they don't have words on them. It's just the koala, little cartoon koala, looks differently. And we've used those with the youngest at times when, if he wanted to go into his room, we had a little plastic sleeve on the door, and we just said, look, can you just put what's going on, pick one of those 20 cards and just put it on your door so we can just come and see how things are. No need to articulate it, but just give us an idea. So how can we help kids start to label and identify how they're feeling? A lovely idea that I haven't used, but a friend had used, was with her daughter. They'd have this journal which just sat under her pillow during the day, and she would write in it to her parents. I think this one was to her mum. And there wouldn't necessarily need to be a conversation, and the mum might just go and write something in it, respond to maybe whatever the question was or what the grief was, or just write something that's happened during the day or pass something on. So I really like that idea. I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about screens and technology. And one of the things that I believe is that we're meant to be in charge of this being revealed to them, the unravelling. And if you give your kid a device at 8, you're not in charge of that. It's very hard to be in charge of that when kids have access to the internet. And so I think it's really important to consider the timeline for your family and your kids and those you're caring for. What will work? I mean, one of the things that's really important is let's look at ourselves first. One of the best things I've done recently is I've turned off all notifications on my phone. So I don't get a ping. I don't even see if I've got emails or Facebook messages and I've got particular ringtones for family members, both for texts and for calls. So I know if it's the train, I know who that is. If it's the bell, I know who that is. And if it's the normal ringtone, well, I can actually not even worry about that. So I think that's been important. I've also been really conscious and because I could do my whole business on a phone. But I'm really cautious as to how that looks if I'm sitting around just on my phone. And so I try my best to do my work on a computer So the kids aren't seeing me just always on the device. Does that make sense? I just think it's something that I want to sort of work hard to do. And, I'm not always great at it. And I'm saying this to myself just as much as anyone else. And just that intrusion that they can be around the home. Is there somewhere you can actually go when you need to do that? Instead of just doing it in the lounge room where the kids are, can you actually just take it to the bedroom and do your thing, or go into the kitchen, or wherever? You might have a particular place where you might do business or send off texts. And the other thing that I feel a little bit disheartened at is when I'm at kids' sport and I see parents on their phones there, because I can actually remember what it feels like to be 10 and seeing my mum and dad on the sidelines. I know the feeling. I'd look for that. I still love it. I still play a bit of Masters AFL, and I love it when my family are there watching. But if they're there and not actually connecting, so I suggest to parents, perhaps you might just want to leave your phone in the glove box. Go out and be seen to be giving them full attention. I actually think it makes a difference. At schools, we try to encourage parents not to send texts. It's really hard sometimes when the kids are not meant to be using phones and parents are sending texts during the day. It's a bit of a conundrum for us as educators. So, generally most stuff, kids aren't really meant to be on their phones at most schools. So I think as the adults we need to be a little cautious of that. And then we mentioned this scaffolding of time, and when are they going to be introduced to TV, movies, gaming? When are they going to get a device? And there's a current thinking that I think 14, I don't think a kid needs a smartphone before 14. And in the template that I'm going to suggest, I think at 14, if you think that's okay, you might say, well, they don't need it till 16. But at 14, I think it's best if you actually loan them one, but you're still sort of in control of it. So you can actually, if it's not used appropriately. There's some great little contracts. Amy Carney has written a book, I think it's called Parenting on Purpose. At the back of that, she's got just a little contract that you draw up with your kid about use of the phone. And then I suggest at 16, the birthday gift might be a phone maybe. Then that's their own. So I think it's important to be ahead of the game with this, though. Like, how can we actually be proactive? And so that's why I'm really excited to be getting into primary schools and working with primary school parents, where we're actually able to say, so when's that going to be, rather than, I've got older kids and thinking, oh, gee, we could have done that a little bit differently. We have a charging station set up at home where kids should not have their phones in their bedrooms. They shouldn't be there. So our kids are charged their phones overnight. They sit there. Cody didn't have a phone because he's not old enough, so he charges his walkie-talkies there so that he doesn't feel completely out of it. We've got little devices there, stopwatches for the kids for their gaming time, which they have to start and stop themselves. So, there are some great ways to sort of think about how to be doing that. What about a day free of tech? What about an hour free of tech in your family? And just say, we're everyone. We're not going to have Sunday between 10 and 4. We're not going to be on our devices. I've heard some lovely stories of what's happened with families. The kids have started to do that thing of approaching the parents and saying, hey, can we go and do this? Can we go for a walk in Kaipo Forest? So, and then what about when friends are over? I've stolen this one from Brené Brown. I think she posted it. But the basket at the door when the friends come over and say, look, in our house, this is just pop that there. You're here to spend time together, so why don't you do that? So these things are all just possibilities, and you'll have your own ideas about whether they'll fit well in your family or not. Regarding age-appropriate movies and games, we love Common Sense Media. So we began by saying to the kids, whatever Common Sense Media says, that's the age that you can watch that movie. Because we just can't watch every movie and be all over everything. And what's happened now is the kids actually are old enough, because they have a device now, that those in their mid-teens, they'll go on that and they'll realise before they even need to ask. So we're saying no less because they're doing all the research themselves. Oh, well, we won't be able to watch that. And the other thing it's done is it's also given us great birthday presents, because we know, you know, when the Harry Potter suggestion is for that particular book, well, then that becomes a great birthday present, if that makes sense. So Common Sense Media, it's a website. They do books, games, and movies and TV shows. The other thing with internet is going to be, do you want to have some particular way of observing, of restricting internet use by the kids? There's a number of things. Some parents would rather have the conversation and trust their kids. Some parents would rather have some kind of something connected to the modem. So Family Zone we've used, which is very effective, but also Our Pact, I know, is a good one that some families have used. Or you can just change the password on your Wi-Fi each day, like on that sticky. The other thing I would mention is when you're going in the car, this is one of the slides that didn't quite translate. I think that if you're going on short trips, we don't let our kids have music in. There is. Like, we sort of keep that. I mean, on a long holiday trip maybe, but it's just a priceless moment. Like, they're trapped, you're going at 60 kilometres an hour, they're there, you know, so you can have these conversations. So just thinking about how that might be. If I was to ask you, at what age, what stage of life do you feel like you shifted from a child to an adult, from a boy to a man or a girl to a woman, what would you say? When would that moment be? So people at home, if you can have a think about that as well, maybe send in some responses. What was the moment?
I think it was when I left school at year 11 and started full-time work.
Yep. So finishing school. Something different?
Yeah, lots of different moments in different areas of life. So the first pash,
yeah,
or the first, I don't know, finding your first job, different areas of your life.
Yeah, yeah. So sort of starting adult things, pashing.
Getting my P's and being able to drive by myself.
Yeah, that's a big moment, isn't it? That blend of freedom and responsibility.
Get Andrew, so.
Okay. What are we getting from home?
Backpacking overseas at 21, went to uni at 17, first job, working full-time, first boyfriend, having a baby. That's interesting.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of it's to do with responsibility. Is often what people... And the thing is, we sort of do it in our Aussie culture. We look back on it a little bit, but you're probably familiar with the fact that a lot of traditional cultures, you know, if you said to them, so when did you become a man or a woman? They would say, well, when I was initiated. There are rites of passage which happen throughout life. There's 5 common ones. We do 3 of them still. We've created a 4th. We've created one before birth, just in recent years, the gender reveal. So that's become a new rite of passage. We've got birth, which we still ceremonialise. Child to adult, not so much. Marriage we still do. Adult to elder. You know, we don't really do that. There'd be some circles of people who would honour that moment. Because, of course, you know, in our culture, what we tend to do is to push our elderly into homes and get other people to look after them. That's quite unusual in a society. Generally, they're still heavily involved and looked to for wisdom. And then death, we still do death. I had a dear friend who passed away at the start of the year. I was asked to be the master of ceremonies at his funeral. I've never done it before. And we didn't end up using a funeral director. So his wife and I sort of planned what would happen. And people came out of the woodwork and said amazing things about Dave. But he was dead and didn't hear a word of it. And do you know what? I reckon it would have been helpful for him to have heard all of that before he died. It's the same with the child to adult. It's where we honour someone when they're alive and they're hearing what we're saying. We've chucked away the two things. I mean, you'd love to be at your funeral and know what's said. You don't know, the birth thing is completely different. Honouring people when they're alive. I think it's really important that we rediscover it. We have also created adolescence. That's never existed before on the planet. We created it. It probably happened when tertiary education came about, so maybe 70, 80 years ago. It was about 2 or 3 years to start with. Guess what's happened over that time until now? It's expanded out so much so that sociologists would suggest that adolescence, which never existed for tens of thousands of years, we've managed to make about a 20-year life cycle. So if I had have grown up in Vanuatu, that might have been my initiation. Or in Central Australia, or on the Mentawai Islands, there's teeth sharpening. There are things that happened that were about shifting children into adulthood, celebrating it, honouring it. They were challenging because they were trying to teach kids that life is hard. And the thing that happens is if we don't do these rites, the kids will do them themselves. That's what schoolies is. Schoolies is a rite of passage, but the problem is it was created by the kids. Do you get that they're not meant to create that? Who's meant to create it? We're meant to create it. It's the job of the elders. So I feel like it's really important for us to recalibrate how this all happens. How can we do a better job? And what can we learn from traditional societies, and how do we make it a contemporary process? So there's special moments all through, childhood for kids. What happens on birthdays? How do we make those special and reverent? Starting school, Menarche, what do we do with our daughters when they start menstruating? Then rite of passage, initiation, driver's licence, and I'll talk about the release a little bit later. I've got a wonderful colleague in Bendigo, Jane Bennett, who has a great book. If you've got daughters, A Blessing Not a Curse is a wonderful way for mums to help celebrate the transition of their girls into young women. And she also runs great Celebration Day for Girls sessions, which are for mums and daughters, and look at celebrating that important transition in life. Neither of my sons, Malachi or Phoenix, actually did the Right Journey, which is the rite of passage program that is in schools. So I took them away and we'd had their rite of passage journey. And so that's something else to consider is as parents, around about 14, what can you do? What can you create? How do you honour the shift? What do you educate them about? Give them some challenges. And then what's the expectation? How do you make sure that things are a little bit different? What do you do in your home? How do you help them to step up? And we'll talk a little bit about that. I've written a book called Phoenix Rising, which just maps out what I did with Phoenix when we went away, which you can get on the website. And that's just a possible template that families might use, just some ideas of how to go about that. We'll also do a little bit of online mentoring as well. And then what about the other adults that you bring into your kids' lives? I've reflected on the fact I actually grew up in a church environment, and I had so many wonderful men around me as a young guy. I was blessed with that. I don't see that much anymore. I'd like to mention one of them who I've just found out tonight actually passed away last week, Gavin Grates, who was a youth group leader of mine. You know, and I have had the opportunity to say thank you to him for the wonderful mentoring and model that he was for me as a kid between 12 and 16. So how do we bring those people into our kids' lives? I've done that for my kids. I'm not necessarily the kind of bloke my sons want to be. They might not like flowery shirts. They might need to see a bloke who wears a check shirt or whatever it is. But how can I just get men around them, women around them, the same with the daughters, and create the village? So we're going to move on to look at this transition template. And there's a lovely poem, which I'd love you to hunt down, called by Henri Nouwen. But he just talks about the fact that birthdays are really important because a birthday is just about that person. No one else. It's all about them. And how can we use those moments? And so this template, and I'm going to go through it quite quickly, but the slides will be available for you to look at in more detail. And what it's doing is saying, why not on a birthday do we say, well, look, in our family, I'm going to flick to the first one here, when you're 2. In our family, what we do is we just tidy up the floor of our room before we go to bed. That's it. And happy birthday. Here's a toy box and some toys and a bookcase and some books. And let's do it. It's your birthday night. Let's do it together. And then maybe you do it together for 1 week, 3 months, 9 months, who knows. But eventually you're just teaching them that that's what we do. Then at 3, you might say, well, in our family when you're 3, you make your bed in the morning and you put your pyjamas under the pillow. And you might get them a nice quilt. And you might get them. Now, you may disagree with 3 being the age for that. If you think 15 is the age you should start making your bed, then you just go to your template and you write down 15. You choose what you feel is right, and it might be different for different kids in the family. But I hope you get the idea of where we're heading. And then there are some other gifts that might work. You know, that if you've got grandparents or uncles and aunties, you can say, well, look, this is what we're doing, and could you get them a hot water bottle because it's going to help with what we're doing. At 4, you might start looking at swings, and the idea is having your kid play outside. Then you might move to 5, and it's to do with school. 6 might be out on the road and riding on the road. And some sports stuff, maybe take them to an event. So for each of these, I wonder, what's the experience you could offer as well? So you're giving them a responsibility, you're giving them a gift that matches the responsibility. You may have a new freedom. So I'm working with primary schools at the moment on developing a similar template. And so it might be, well, in year 2 at our school, you actually carry your bag from the car and put it on the hook yourself. I've had some interesting feedback where a particular school I was working at, during COVID here in Adelaide, which was only a very short period of time, but when the kids were going to school but the parents weren't allowed on site, suddenly the kids had to carry their bags because the parents could only leave them in the car park. Do you know what happened when the parents were allowed back on site? They started carrying the bags again. So sometimes, we need to set the boundaries. So that's one example of working in schools. But then in schools, it's also, and what's the freedom? Well, when you're in year 2, you get to go on the swings over there that you weren't allowed to. So we're trying to build some anticipation as well as some responsibility. So as we move through, the idea that kids are going to become resilient which is what we know parents want from the research I've done, without them failing, without them taking risks, without them having challenges, it's a little bit like expecting them to be able to ride a bike but you never take off the training wheels. How do we give them this experience of building resilience? At 7, we've done gardening sets. They've got their own fruit tree that they grow, and they start to get some pocket money and have a little give, save, spend idea. Moving into 8, we've done pets. And also this is when Cody got his walkie-talkie, so he was able to go out the street at the age of 8 down to the playground just by himself. The first day, we talk him all the way through. Okay, Cody, at the front door yet? Over. All the way down. And the beauty of the walkie-talkie is that he can now just carry that on his bike now that he's 10 and he rides around the neighbourhood. So he's got that if he needs to check in. At 9, in our family, the kids start making their school lunches. Now, our youngest has older brothers, and they convinced him he should be making their lunches even earlier than 9, which he was actually quite happy doing. But this idea of being a bit self-reliant and saying, yep, you can do that at 9. So maybe getting a pocket knife, doing maybe some camping stuff. Then at 10 in our family, you get an alarm clock and a watch, and you're expected to be on time. That's it. You're going to be at the door. One of the mistakes sometimes we make as parents is us being in charge of them getting up. That's a terrible idea, because there's only one person who's going to get blamed if they're late. I helped a boarding school in New Zealand change they realised that the staff were in charge of waking the kids up. These secondary kids in a New Zealand boarding house. And they just realised, as I was saying this bit, the terrible mistake they'd made, and that they shifted that around. So giving these kids the responsibility. At 11, the kids learn to use the washing machine. They'll have some wonderful learnings. Malachi learned that his iPod doesn't last a full wash cycle. It was quite a few years ago now. And he also learned not to put his new red T-shirt in with his cricket whites, because he'd be wearing a sort of salmon-shaded outfit out to bat on Saturday morning. Getting them a clothes voucher, and then maybe choosing their own clothes, how to use the iron. So suddenly that becomes the basis. And using a washing machine these days is not like it was for Nana, where it's just put the powder in there, turn the knob to there and press that button. It's very simple. They're doing a lot more complex things like that on an Xbox while they're getting shot at. And I say to them, you don't even have to hide, mate. You're not going to need to duck. You can spend an hour there trying to do those 3 things if you want. So at 12, we think a trip away. And again, some people might think this is young, but pop them on a plane, have family. It mightn't be quite as easy at this point in time, but have family meet them or friends meet them somewhere else, so that little bit of independence. At 13, they start to cook a meal once a fortnight. And we give them maybe a cooker. One of the nicest things, and this is my sister's, that's the recipe book. So we get friends and family to all send a handwritten recipe, and the kids have a recipe book that they can use. Does this sort of all make sense? At 14, you may want to gift them loan them the phone. We've started giving the kids some money that they then buy stuff with. So they have to pay for toiletries and a variety of things. We get them, we talk to them about social media use. They need to start booking their own appointments. You need to have that lesson with them. This is how you do this, because they've got the phone now. This is your responsibility. And perhaps the camping out solo. 15, it's a good tool set, and it's about taking care of things and taking care of relationships as well. At 16, it's to do with driving and maybe sort of starting to get a nice outfit or something like that. At 17, we think again looking at some financial literacy. The kids are then in charge of buying their clothing and recreation and treats. And then at 18, it becomes about things like, I've typically given the kids something that has been educating them about the blend of freedom and responsibility. So on that hip flask, it says something like, with freedom comes responsibility. On Dante's particular backpack, it says something like, roam free with purpose. So helping them understand that responsibility and freedom are linked. And I want to quickly talk to you about the release ceremony that we do at 18. So we have quite a significant ceremony at 18 for the kids, and it's really about letting them understand they've crossed the threshold and they're now adults, and that means we need to step back. You have to make a deal of it. I say to them, you're making it difficult because you're still living in my house. So there are rules. There are things that you're going to have to do because you're here in this house. But I'm not going to tell you who you should date. I'm not going to tell you what you should study. There's a whole lot of things that you now need to ask me about. I've worked with men who still struggle with the expectations of their parents. And that's something I want to free my kids of. And say, look, this is yours. You've got to make some mistakes. And I will always have an opinion, you know, and I'll be very happy to tell you, but you've got to ask me this stuff now. This is your life. They're 18. Does it make sense? We've given them all these freedoms. We need to actually let them step forward a bit. We've got to step back a little bit. And the other thing, so we get other people to come along and honour them at that point. And I've also chosen to have a therapy session with them. And that's around them telling me what a crap dad I've been, basically. But what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to clear the slate for our adult relationship. Like, they're now adults, I'm an adult. Let's get rid of all that stuff that's happened. And I just listen back. And it's full on, because, you know, a lot of it's questionable. But it's their experience, and so I just reflect back and say, "Yep, okay, so I didn't support you in that moment when you wanted it." It's not about me saying, "Well, I think I did. It's just hearing them, and that way. And I say, you know, I can't promise that there won't be other stuff that'll come up from now on, but I hope you get the idea of that, which is really about just clearing the surface for our adult relationship. So. This has been written up in a parenting anthology called Future Kind. There's a chapter in there called Responsibility Parenting, which you can track down. We've got this on our fridge at home, this idea that, you know, if your kid can operate a smartphone, then they're probably pretty good at those things. So how do they contribute? What are their contributions around the house? Amy Carney, who I've mentioned already, she has a list of things that I'm going to show now. 8 things you shouldn't be doing for your teenager. So I often get parents to test themselves on this. So you shouldn't be waking them up in the morning. Shouldn't be making their breakfast and packing their lunch. Filling out their paperwork. Delivering forgotten items. I've heard of a mum who bought herself a chicken suit online expressly for the purpose of when her kid forgot something at school, she donned the chicken suit, turned up at the school, walked to the front office to deliver the lunchbox, and I think she's bargaining on the fact that won't happen again. Don't make their failure to plan your emergency. Laundry, we've mentioned, emailing and calling their teachers and coaches, and doing their schoolwork. So I hope that all sort of makes sense. We've developed a few resources in the last couple of years, some conversation cards. So when I took my boys away on their rite of passage journey, we took these cards. There's a set for guys and a set for women. They're slightly different. And there's about 80 cards, and there's probably about 5 or 6 questions on each. And I've got them out over here for those of you who are here live, and for those of you at home, you can hit up the Right Journey website and they'll be on the shop page there. We've got a deal going at the moment for Father's Day, just for the next few days. Coupon code is FD21, and you can get 20% off of these, the Man-Made cards and the Phoenix Rising book. So there's the female cards, the Woman Wise cards, which were written with Jane Bennett. So I've got a mate who has his cards in the glove box, and when he's dropping his lad off at sports practice, just pulls out a random card, has the conversation with him. Just building that connection. We have a website and a Facebook page. The Facebook page, I generally put parenting stuff on, so, and I know there's a few people here and online who would have heard about it through that, so thank you so much for your support there. There's some blogs I've written. The one in the middle there, actually, Initiation by Accident. For those of you who have kids who are starting to drive, that's a good one to read. That was about Phoenix having hit a kangaroo at 120 k's an hour and having almost a replica accident to one that I had at a similar age, and how can we help kids with that? I think that is a real rite of passage moment, your first accident. And, you know, if there was some way we could get, and it's sort of what rites of passage did. They tried to teach kids, you've got to actually life is difficult, it's hard, and it's dangerous. And you know, that accident that I had, which I was completely fine with and so was Phoenix, I mean, I'd almost script that for every boy. If they could have an accident where they were fine and just have a wake-up call. Does that make sense? It's sort of what the traditional initiations did. I'm going to put up 3 slides of books that I would recommend. These ones are generally about parenting girls, this first slide, so feel free to grab a pic of them. There's some good ones there. The top 2 are probably the newest. I know one I haven't got on there by Madonna King, who wrote Being 14 at the top right there. She's just released a new book called 10-Ager, which is reflecting on the fact that, you know, a 10-year-old is not now what a 10-year-old used to be. So that's a good one to have a look at. If you've got boys in your life, probably the bottom right there is the newest and perhaps going to be sort of the Bible for raising boys by Maggie Dent. That one's called From Boys to Men. But I also love Celia Lashley's up there, which is He'll Be Okay. And then this one's just some sort of responsibility parenting. And the titles sort of let you know, like The Gift of Failure, Beautiful Failures, The Spoon-Fed Generation. They're certainly helpful in us working out how we can skill up our kids in responsibility. So as we finish off, this idea that, you know, anything you can do for a teenager that they can do for themselves is sort of robbing them of the opportunity of stepping up. It's one of the phrases I sometimes use with parents, which is, when we choose to step in, we're usually preventing the child from stepping up. So just being mindful of those moments. So there are my contact details there. I know that we'll be sending out the slides because I jumped over the ages there a little bit, so you'll get a copy of those. And also just a blank template for you to have a play with what you think might be appropriate with your kids in your life. So that's that. We're going to have some questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Let's just give Andrew a round of applause while we come up on stage. He's got a few minutes to go. Andrew, you are extraordinarily proactive. I think a number of us as parents are going, oh, have I missed the mark? My delightful child is 17 and I haven't done any of these things. What would be your suggestion if you've got a 15-year-old, and as you look at these things, you think, man, I actually haven't kind of built this in. Where would I start if that was the case?
The first thing is, please don't mention my name when you go home and tell them all of the things that they're going to be doing as of now. No, I actually wonder whether just a conversation with them. is to say, look, actually, I've just come across some information about, growing up kids, and I'm interested to tell you about it and to see what you think. And I might do a few things in the next little while that are just really aimed at, we're talking about how do we create adults, that are responsible, resilient, reflective, resourceful, and so that would be my starting point, I think. And with parents, I'll often say, as with that particular survey we did, what's the end point? What do you want at the end point? Now, if you actually want a child that's dependent on you for things, then you're going to do it quite differently to the suggestion. So it is, I'm not telling people what kind of kids they should raise, but I think if you can think about, well, what do we want at the end point? And even when do we want that end point? You may say, well, 18's ridiculous. That shouldn't be the case. That should be 25. And then use 25 as your benchmark and work back from 25. But I think, the conversation with the kids, obviously with co-parents, if there's a co-parent who's not here. But I do find that generally parents get it. I had a dad who was in a session just recently. He was a plumber, and he said, you're right. He said, I've been a plumber for 2 decades. He said, in the first decade, I never sacked an apprentice. In the last decade, I've sacked 12. He said, I can't even tell them, that's not how you do that, without needing to book them a counselling appointment to recover from the damage that's caused them. So just that, it was interesting just to hear that perspective.
I must say, so I've got 4 children, and under 12 or so, and then over 12. And I must say, the rituals have gotten harder as you hit the teenagehood. So, going to bed and those rituals, eating together, all those rituals have been a lot harder. But you've given us good ideas, I think, about things that we could start to build in. Sarah, do we have any questions from folk online?
Yes, I've got one here from a parent that says, she said, I'm divorced. I want to give my son an opportunity of a rite of passage, but his father would not be involved. Can a mother do this with her son?
Yeah, a mother can. Or there are a number of organisations that run sessions where for instance, here in South Australia, there's a group that go to Kangaroo Island, maybe called the Kangaroo Island Men's Group or something like that, where they take boys, and it can be with a father or a male mentor or not. And then there's also, so in each state, I know Darren Lewis does wonderful work up in Queensland and does, his company's called Fathering Adventures, and he does some work up there. So either find a group that might do, run a particular camp style, or there might be uncles or other friends, or I think a mum, can certainly do it. The one thing I think about is possibly that sometimes I guess boys can look at mums differently to men, I guess. I think one of the things why I started Right Journey originally was because I felt that the boys didn't have men in their lives. I noticed that the boys had mainly been taught by female primary teachers, so I did a survey with the kids, and they'd had 1 year, the boys, of a male teacher. Most of them had mum in their lives. Many of them, dad was either absent or not around, and I felt like they just needed to have the man speaking into the life.
There is an increasing place for grandparents as well.
Yeah.
So I've noticed that if the family's separated, that a grandfather can be quite a key role model.
That's true, Jason.
That's probably a good idea to think about that family. I've got a related question. So I've got a mate who's watching online, and he's in a separated family situation where he'd like to kind of put certain values and rights and traditions into his family, but because it's not now a shared commitment, what do you do in that situation?
I mean, I've had a similar situation myself, and we just do what we can in our house, and the kids will be aware that there are different things going on in the different homes, and sometimes that's been tough. But we've actually found the older the kids have got, the more they've actually realised that what we've been doing is really better than it being a bit looser. So we've had that experience. So I think that's the reality for a lot of families now, and all we can do is what's in our circle of influence, and so we've just worked on holding that tightly. And for a while, it looked like that might not backfire, but was not as appreciated. But as I mentioned, as the kids have got older, it's shifted. So
had another person ask a question about doing the Phoenix Rising with their child, but with COVID lockdowns and things, how might that be adapted?
Yeah, I mean that's a tough one. We're speaking here from South Australia, where we've been so fortunate and haven't needed to sort of work out how we can do things differently. I think certainly locally, I mean, with Malachi, we did go interstate. With Phoenix, we actually went overseas because we were visiting family. So it was a bit of a different experience. But I think certainly locally, I mean, you could possibly even just do it in your backyard. I mean, there are elements of it that you could do at home. I think, we are trying to create an experience that is a little bit different. So probably, I mean, if you went camping, you don't have to go a long way.
For us, Deep Creek or
Deep Creek,
it's not too far away.
Yeah, but but for those who are, I mean, I would even suggest you might think of just postponing it rather than thinking, well, I need to do it at this moment. You could say, well, look, what's it going to look like? What could we possibly do in 9 months or a year? Might be worth having a look at. Yeah.
Now, I think you're quite strategic, Andrew, in working with schools, because there's a lot of, it's one of the few remaining communities that we have where young people are all, formed, and the teachers have massive influence. You've got sports clubs as well, as you've mentioned. You do actually have churches, but what if a family aren't kind of plugged into that community where you mentioned you had Gavin Gratz looking out for you, people who weren't necessarily related to you but great. What could they do there?
Yeah, I mean that's why you're right, Jason. That's why I've worked in schools, because it's that last place. And one of the things with doing some kind of process like this is it's really hard. So if we use the camp model, where a lad goes off and does something at Kangaroo Island, has a great experience, but comes back into a school where none of the other kids have done that, plays at a sports club where none of the other kids have done that. It's really hard for that kid to hold what he's learned and experienced without having that supported around him with peers. And that's why I just think schools are such an ideal place for that to happen, where everyone's had a similar experience. And so, to answer your question, I think, going to schools, if you're a parent, going to a school, and sometimes I'll have parents, and it doesn't need to be right journey, it can be whatever, but going to the school and saying, look, is there some way you can facilitate this? But it is looking for those opportunities. Some sports clubs are doing it reasonably, but others aren't,
There are different rights, and most of them aren't great, I'd say.
Yeah.
But that's all getting kind of dealt with, I think. Look, I really appreciate what you've said. I will say this: we are able to send to you the slides and other resources that Andrew has mentioned. I'd like to imagine that we could go away from here and take something, at least one thing of what you said, and put it into practice.
I aimed high, Jason. I said 2.
2 things to put into practice. That would be great. What our church also does is we buy resources so we intend to buy a number of the resources that Andrew's got on sale here or selling over here, and actually, if you want to use them, you can come just knock on the office and say, "Can I borrow it?" And and then you can borrow it from us. So obviously you can't borrow it from us if you live in Melbourne, but you can borrow it from us if you live near our church. Anything just to finish from you, Sarah?
No, I think you've had a few really good little sayings in amongst that, and one of them I really liked was about guidance, not guarding, and I thought that was just a really helpful little phrase just to remember as we go. And I had an experience with my son where I realised there was a situation at school that I probably could have entered into, but I had to really stop hard and think to myself to not enter into it. And in hindsight, I was really glad I didn't. So I think also what you're speaking about, parents just taking a minute to step back and say, you know what, I don't need to step into this. I can let my child take the stage and let them deal with it and see what happens. And I also remember one time one of my daughters, when she was in high school, was going through something difficult, and someone had said something to her, and I said, do I need to do something about this? And she said, no, Mum, no, don't you get involved, you know, just almost telling me off for thinking I should step into it. And I think that was quite healthy, that she realised, I don't want you to step into this, that's not going to work, I just needed to tell you about it. So
I think it was the chicken suit that put her off.
Yeah. I will remember that one.
Very good. Well, our church does value families. We think that families make the foundation of our society, and if we are strengthening our families and our parents and our children and our young people, then our society is better off. So we hope that you've been encouraged, that you'll be strengthened. And we want to pray a prayer of blessing on you. We pray that God might strengthen your families and that your children grow up, just as Andrew's pitched, that they'll be respectful and responsible and a great delight to you as you grow together. So have a great week, and thank you for joining us tonight. Much appreciated.
Thanks to everyone who's here, and thanks to everyone at home for tuning in. Appreciate it.